Cary Grant was Hollywood's golden man, the embodiment of charm, sophistication, and effortless charisma. Women adored him, men envied him, and studios relied on his box office magic. When he married Dyan Cannon, a young, vivacious, rising star, the world saw it as a love story from a classic Hollywood romance. But the reality? It was nothing like the fairy tale the public believed. Behind closed doors, the glitz and glamour of their marriage faded into a disturbing reality. Dyan Cannon would later expose shocking details about the man behind the silver screen legend. What really went on in their marriage? Why did their love story spiral into darkness so quickly? And how did Cary Grant's true nature turn their romance into something far more unsettling? The truth is more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. Their love story defied the odds, but trouble was brewing from the very start. Cary Grant was the kind of man who didn't just walk into a room, he commanded it. With his smooth voice, sharp suits, and undeniable charm, he wasn't just a Hollywood star, he was a Hollywood star. By the time he met Dyan Cannon, he had already lived a life filled with success, wealth, and more than his share of romances. He had been married 3 times before, each relationship ending in its way. Yet, the public still saw him as the ultimate gentleman. Dyan Cannon was a completely different energy. Young, vibrant, and full of ambition, she had a spark that set her apart from other rising actresses in Hollywood. She was intelligent, independent, and driven, qualities that made her both fascinating and unpredictable. When she crossed paths with Cary Grant, the connection was instant. It was the kind of chemistry that made headlines, the type of romance that seemed too good to be true. The 33-year age gap between them was impossible to ignore. At a time when Hollywood's leading men routinely paired with much younger actresses on screen, seeing it play out in real life only added to the intrigue. How did a man in his late 50s win the heart of a woman in her mid-20s? Was it experience, confidence, or something more calculated? Dyan was swept off her feet. Cary was everything, a man who seemed to have the answers to life's biggest questions. He spoke with wisdom, carried himself with an air of self-assurance, and made her feel like she was stepping into something greater than just a relationship. To the world, it was a Cinderella story where the charming prince had finally found his match. But was that the truth? Or was this the beginning of something far more complicated? By 1965, their romance had peaked, leading to a highly publicized wedding. Hollywood's elite gathered in awe, watching as one of the industry's most sophisticated stars married a promising new talent. The media painted it as a union of love and admiration, a perfect match despite the stark age difference. Behind the scenes, however, their relationship was moving at an alarming pace. While Grant appeared deeply in love, some close to the couple questioned his true intentions. Was this a man who had finally found his soulmate, or was he looking for something else? Control, stability, or perhaps even a way to hold on to his youth? Dyan was madly in love, but even in the earliest days, there were signs that her world was about to change in ways she never anticipated. The early days seemed magical, but cracks in the marriage appeared almost immediately. Their wedding was nothing short of spectacular. It had all the elements of a Hollywood fairy tale, an iconic leading man, a stunning young bride, and the world watching in admiration. The press followed their every move, painting a picture of true love that seemed untouched by the challenges of fame. But behind the perfectly curated smiles and carefully posed photographs, a different reality was taking shape. Dyan Cannon had stepped into a world unlike anything she had known before. Marrying Cary Grant meant stepping into a carefully controlled environment, one that revolved around his rules, his expectations, and his carefully constructed way of life. At first, it felt like stability, a sense of order that contrasted with the unpredictable nature of Hollywood. But it didn't take long before that stability started feeling suffocating. Cary Grant had always been a perfectionist. On screen, his performances were effortless, but behind the scenes, every detail was meticulously calculated. His approach to life was no different. He expected structure, precision, and discipline, not just in his work but in his home as well. It wasn't enough for things to be in place, they had to be in his place. Dyan, who had always been free-spirited and independent, found herself constantly adjusting to avoid his disapproval. At first, she tried to see it as endearing. She convinced herself that his attention to detail was simply a sign of his passion for life. But small requests soon turned into unspoken rules. The way she dressed, the way she spoke, the way she carried herself in public, everything was under his scrutiny. Even the smallest misstep, like forgetting to use a coaster or not parking the car perfectly straight, could send him into quiet frustration. He never raised his voice, but his disappointment cut just as deeply. Dyan began to feel the weight of constant pressure, not just to be a good wife, but to meet a standard that was impossible to reach. She wasn't just married to Cary Grant. She was now part of the carefully curated image he had spent decades building. His expectations weren't just about love, they were about control. To the outside world, they seemed blissfully happy. The press captured their smiles, their affectionate glances, their glamorous outings. No one suspected that behind closed doors, Dyan was beginning to feel more like a guest in her own life, rather than an equal partner in her marriage. The tension in their marriage only worsened as Grant's controlling nature took over. At first, Dyan Cannon believed she had married a man who was wise, charming, and protective. But as time passed, it became clear that Cary Grant's protectiveness was something far more controlling. He didn't just love her, he wanted to shape her, mold her, and dictate the way she lived. His household was not just a home, it was a place of unspoken rules and quiet tension, where every action was monitored and judged. Dyan quickly learned that nothing escaped his attention. If a coaster wasn't placed under a glass, he noticed. If she parked the car slightly crookedly in the driveway, it became a topic of discussion. But it wasn't just about small household details. He scrutinized her social interactions, questioning why she was so friendly with the mailman or why she spoke too long with a neighbor. To him, any act of warmth toward others was a sign of disloyalty. At first, she tried to rationalize his jealousy. Maybe it was a sign that he truly cared. Maybe he was just trying to protect what they had. But over time, the paranoia behind his actions became impossible to ignore. If she laughed a little too much at another man's joke, he noticed. If she seemed too engaged in a conversation at an event, his demeanor would shift. He never had to raise his voice to assert control. His silence, his disappointment, and his subtle disapproval were enough to make her second-guess herself. Dyan started changing without realizing it. She became more careful, more restrained, and more isolated. She avoided certain conversations, limited her interactions, and slowly withdrew from friends and acquaintances. She wasn't just trying to keep the peace, she was trying to avoid the slow, painful unraveling of his trust. Cary Grant had mastered the art of control without ever appearing outwardly cruel. He didn't yell or threaten, he simply made it clear that his way was the right way, and when things didn't go his way, he didn't react with anger, he reacted with deep disappointment, which, in some ways, was even worse. Dyan began to feel like she was constantly failing, no matter how hard she tried. Their home, once a place of romance and security, became a silent battleground. Every action was measured and every decision was carefully considered. Dyan Cannon, once full of life and energy, was slowly shrinking under the weight of expectations she could never fully meet. To understand Grant's behavior, we must look at his troubled past. Cary Grant was not born into the world of elegance and sophistication that he later came to embody. Before he became the Hollywood legend, he was Archibald Leach, a boy from Bristol, England, raised in a world of hardship and uncertainty. His childhood was far from the glamorous life he would one day create. Instead, it was marked by poverty, loss, and emotional turmoil, a past that would shape him in ways he could never fully escape. The most defining wound of his early life came when he was just 9 years old. One day, his mother, Elsie Leach, simply disappeared. For years, he was told that she had left, abandoning him and his father without explanation. What he didn't know was that his father had secretly institutionalized her in a mental hospital, leaving young Archie to believe that he had been unwanted, discarded, and unloved. The betrayal cut deep, planting a seed of mistrust and abandonment that would stay with him forever. For most of his youth, he was left to fend for himself emotionally, learning to survive without ever truly trusting those around him. He found escape in the theater, joining a performance troupe as a teenager, where he reinvented himself. He trained his voice, his posture, and his presence, slowly crafting the persona that the world would one day recognize as Cary Grant. But no matter how carefully he built his image, the wounds of his past remained buried beneath the surface. This fear of abandonment and emotional instability followed him into adulthood. Though the world saw him as the epitome of charm and composure, those closest to him often saw a different side. His relationships were marked by control and detachment, an attempt to ensure that he would never feel the kind of loss and vulnerability that he had experienced as a child. He married and divorced 3 times before meeting Dyan Cannon, each failed marriage reinforcing his belief that love was unpredictable and fragile. Desperate for answers, Grant turned to LSD therapy, something unheard of for a Hollywood star of his stature. He believed that by exploring the depths of his mind, he could finally confront the ghosts of his past. Through these sessions, he claimed to have gained insight into his insecurities, fears, and emotional struggles. He spoke openly about the experience, calling it a revelation. But if he truly found clarity, it wasn't enough to change the way he treated those closest to him. Was his behavior towards Dyan Cannon a reflection of his unresolved trauma? Was his need for control and dominance simply a desperate attempt to create the stability he had never known as a child? Or was it something more? Despite their struggles, one thing kept them tied together: their daughter. In 1966, Cary Grant and Dyan Cannon welcomed their daughter, Jennifer Grant, into the world. For a brief moment, it seemed as though parenthood might bring them closer together, that the love they had for their child would be enough to mend the fractures in their marriage. But instead of bridging the gap between them, it only highlighted the deep divide that had already taken hold. Cary had spent his entire life meticulously crafting and controlling everything around him, and now he saw fatherhood as another role to perfect. He was adoring, protective, and deeply invested in Jennifer's life, but in a way that mirrored his intense need for control. He wanted things done a certain way, and when they weren't, tension followed. What Dyan had once endured alone, she now saw reflected in how Grant approached their daughter's upbringing. For Dyan, motherhood was freedom. It was a chance to embrace something purely loving, something that wasn't dictated by rules or expectations. But for Cary, it was another part of life that needed to be carefully managed. His overbearing tendencies, his high expectations, and his unpredictable mood shifts made it impossible for Dyan to ignore what she had been denying for too long. She couldn't live under his control any longer. The love she had once felt for Cary had turned into exhaustion. She was tired of the constant scrutiny, the quiet disapproval, the emotional weight of trying to be perfect. She was no longer the wide-eyed young actress who had fallen in love with the most charming man in Hollywood. She was now a mother, and that gave her a new kind of strength. She had to make a choice, not just for herself, but for her daughter. In 1968, after just 2 years of marriage, Dyan Cannon made the painful decision to walk away. Their divorce became one of the most talked-about breakups in Hollywood, not just because of who they were, but because of what it revealed about the man behind the legend. The public had always seen Cary Grant as the epitome of class and charm. Now they were confronted with a different version, one that Dyan refused to keep hidden. The media picked sides. Some saw her as a woman who had been too young and too naive to handle a man of Grant's stature. Others saw her as a survivor, someone who had escaped a marriage that had been emotionally suffocating. Hollywood, as it often did, remained divided, protective of its golden icon yet unable to ignore the weight of Dyan's words. As for Jennifer, she grew up in two very different worlds, one shaped by her father's intensity and discipline, the other by her mother's warmth and emotional openness. Though she would later write about her love and admiration for Cary Grant, she never denied that their relationship had been complex and, at times, deeply challenging. Even after the divorce, their story was far from over. After the dust settled on their highly publicized divorce, Dyan Cannon and Cary Grant went down very different paths. For Dyan, leaving the marriage was an escape, but it wasn't the end of the emotional battle. She had been deeply in love with a man who had slowly chipped away at her sense of self, and even after walking away, the weight of those years stayed with her. Hollywood, always eager for a scandal, kept a close eye on her next moves. Many expected her to fade into the background, to disappear after her divorce from one of the most legendary actors in film history. But she did the opposite. She threw herself into her career, determined to prove that she was more than just Cary Grant's ex-wife. Over the years, she found success as both an actress and a filmmaker, earning critical acclaim and even an Academy Award nomination. Yet, no matter how far she moved forward, she couldn't fully outrun the emotional scars left by her marriage. Cary Grant, on the other hand, chose a quieter existence. Just a few years after the divorce, he did something unthinkable for a Hollywood icon. He walked away from acting entirely. At the height of his career, a man who had been the face of some of cinema's greatest films simply left the industry behind. Many speculated on the reasons. Had he grown tired of the business, or was he simply trying to escape his demons? Retirement didn't bring him the peace he might have hoped for. His failed marriages haunted him, each one adding another layer to the deep insecurities he had carried since childhood. He focused his time on business ventures, becoming an executive at a cosmetics company, a far cry from the world of film he had once ruled. But something about him seemed different. The man who had once been the symbol of effortless charm now seemed like a relic of a bygone era, caught between who he had been and who he had tried to become. Despite everything, he and Dyan never fully severed ties. They remained connected through their daughter, Jennifer, and over the years their relationship softened into something more civil. There were no grand reconciliations, no sweeping apologies, but there was an understanding, an unspoken acknowledgement of the complicated past they shared. Jennifer Grant would later offer her perspective on her parents' relationship. She spoke of her father with love and admiration, remembering his warmth, humor, and intelligence. But she never denied that he had his flaws, that his relationships had been filled with emotional distance and unspoken pain. She saw firsthand the weight of his past and the way it shaped his need for control and perfection. So, did Cary Grant ever truly find peace? Or did he remain trapped by the ghosts of his past, forever chasing the stability that had always eluded him? Decades later, Cannon revealed even more in her memoir. For decades, Dyan Cannon held on to the memories of her marriage, the good, the bad, and the deeply painful. She had spent years trying to understand what went wrong, trying to make sense of the man she once loved and the emotional turmoil he had put her through. But in 2011, she decided it was time to tell the world her side of the story. Her memoir, Dear Cary, wasn't just another Hollywood tell-all, it was deeply personal, raw, and unfiltered. She didn't hold back as she described the overwhelming control, the unpredictable mood swings, and the psychological weight of being married to a man who expected perfection at all times. She painted a picture of a marriage that looked beautiful from the outside, but was suffocating behind closed doors. The book shocked many. The world had always seen Cary Grant as a symbol of suave elegance, but Cannon's words peeled back the layers, revealing a complicated, insecure, and deeply troubled man. She spoke about his obsession with control, his need to dictate every detail of her life, and the emotional exhaustion she endured. She also touched on his use of LSD therapy, something he had openly supported, but which, according to her, had contributed to his unpredictable behavior. For some, Dear Cary was a long overdue revelation, a chance to see the truth behind the carefully maintained Hollywood image. For others, it was hard to accept. Could Cary Grant, the man who had defined the golden age of Hollywood, really have been so deeply flawed? Then, in 2023, the story resurfaced in a major way. ITV released Archie, a miniseries about Cary Grant's life, diving into both his career and his troubled personal relationships. With Cannon serving as an executive producer, it was clear that her perspective would be woven into the narrative. The series humanized Grant, portraying his struggles with abandonment, relationships, and control, but it also confirmed many of the dark truths Cannon had exposed in her memoir. The miniseries didn't aim to villainize him, but rather to show the full picture, a man who was both iconic and flawed, charismatic yet deeply insecure. The response was divisive. Some viewers felt sympathy for Grant, seeing him as a product of his painful past. Others saw validation in Cannon's words, recognizing the toxic patterns she had endured. In recent interviews, Cannon has stood by her story, reinforcing the claims she made in her memoir. She acknowledges that Grant was not just one thing, that he was complicated, brilliant, and deeply troubled all at once. But she remains firm in her truth. Her marriage to him was not the fairy tale people once believed. So, did Cannon's revelations change how we remember Cary Grant? Or did they simply add depth to a man Hollywood had always kept at arm's length? The real question is, how will history remember Cary Grant? Cary Grant's name remains synonymous with Hollywood greatness. Decades after his passing, his films are still celebrated, his charm is still admired, and his legacy as one of the greatest actors in history remains untouched by time. But beyond the silver screen, his life was anything but perfect. His marriage to Dyan Cannon revealed a side of him that the world was never meant to see. A man battling his demons, his insecurities, and his desperate need for control. Dyan Cannon's decision to speak out changed the narrative. She didn't just tell the story of a difficult marriage, she exposed the dark reality behind the Hollywood fantasy. She gave a voice to the unspoken struggles of being in a relationship with a man who was both captivating and controlling, charming yet emotionally unpredictable. By doing so, she forced the world to see Cary Grant not just as an icon, but as a man, one with flaws, trauma, and unresolved pain. Their marriage is a reminder that fame does not equal happiness. It highlights the darker side of love, the toll of emotional control, and the reality of living with a man who seemed untouchable to the world but deeply troubled behind closed doors. It raises a question that many still struggle with today. Can we separate the legend from the person? Was Cary Grant simply a victim of his past? A man whose childhood abandonment shaped his fears and drove him to seek control over others? Or was he fully aware of the pain he inflicted, unwilling or unable to change the way he treated those closest to him? The answer isn't simple, but one thing is clear. His story is no longer just about his films, his fame, or his on-screen charisma. It is also about the complicated, deeply human struggles that existed behind the Hollywood curtain, and in that truth, his legacy will forever be both brilliant and deeply flawed.